All right. The last story, and there's actually two links for this, comes from also Bleeping Computer, and the title is Ultralytics AI model hijacked to infect thousands with Cryptominer.
Rude.
Totally rude. Now, certainly not the worst thing that could happen to a computer. As I've talked about in the past, if you're going to get hacked and somebody's going to do something on your computer, running a Cryptominer isn't the worst thing in the world because it's relatively simple to detect and isn't really going to steal your data necessarily. But the story here is something that we've seen happen quite a lot, where a bad actor has found their way into a repository, GitHub repository, and planted some malware. So that part is relatively, I think, straightforward. There is a complimentary blog post of I'm not even sure how this person is related to the whole thing, but he put together a very comprehensive sequence of events and timeline like I've not seen happen in a little while. And I think it was possible because this is all happening on a public GitHub repository. The software that this company produces is open source, and so basically there appears like there was a couple of GitHub action vulnerabilities that allowed an attacker to run some commands as part of the CI/CD pipeline, and that allowed them to obtain some credentials. They used those credentials to inject some malicious code, and that resulted in 2 releases that contained the Cryptominer. They subsequently released, they were informed of the issue. They were subsequently released a clean version. And then I think it was 2 days later, another 1 or 2 releases, again, malicious releases were pushed out again. This time through it appears like the attacker used some credentials stolen in the first attack that gave access to the PyPy library where the attacker uploaded the malicious version. So the first one was they modified the GitHub repository, went through all of the release process, and that ended up on PyPy as well. That got taken down. They released a good version. The second instance, the adversary actually uploaded the infected library directly to PyPy, not going through the GitHub release process. And I think the thing that I wanted to cover in this is the complexity that and diligence that you have to put in after an attack. Now, the first attack, you can say, well, like that was not great. But when you look under the covers, like that's really obscure stuff. Mistakes like that can happen, and they will happen, and it's bad, and we need to do everything we can to avoid it. But we're starting to see a trend of this. We saw it most recently with Internet Archive. Very similar kind of, attack path, right? They were attacked and hacked, got cleaned up, and they came back because there were still authentication secrets that had been stolen and not rotated. I think as a industry, and especially when you've got something like an open source repository where maybe it's not the same level of, like, there isn't a necessarily like an incident response team, right? I think that's where we start running into some of these issues where it's the actions that we have to take to clean up are perhaps more onerous and more complex, more thorough than they might seem at first blush. And I think if we don't get more serious about this, we're gonna keep seeing this sort of thing happen. And at the moment, by the way, I don't want to say it's benign, because it's not benign. I don't want to downplay the significance of what happened here, but it's by far far from like a worst case scenario. Like, you can absolutely imagine a much more horrific set of circumstances than deploying a crypto miner. But this is, and it will happen, by the way. Like, that's going to happen. It's going to end up with ransomware. It's going to end up with info stealers. Who knows? So, and maybe if it's an info stealer, like, it's happening all the time already, and we just don't know it, because it's not. The only reason we know it, this is happening, is because somebody saw their CPU spiking 100% and said, "Oh, what the heck is going on?" But look, we have to get more serious about this.
First of all, if you're not leveraging the GPU in the system, you're just not doing it right. Let's just be clear.
It's true. Why are my fans spinning?
Amateurs. I agree. I mean, we've got a couple things here that I wanted to comment on. One is obviously the supply chain risk of dependencies in open source and pulling in third-party dependencies, and how can you trust them? And I don't know that we've got that figured out yet either. And how often do you update them, and how quickly are you monitoring? And do you have some tool that's helping you know when these things happen? That's a whole problem. The other thing is, to your point on being able to clean it up well, I think that's also predicated on having a foundational knowledge, a deep understanding of the environment that a lot of teams maybe don't have. And that, I think, is a problem. Like, especially like, I wonder how, I'm sure they've got techniques and playbooks for this, but I think about the Mandiants of the world and these other, emergency response teams that come in during an incident, try to clean it up. They're coming in cold, no knowledge of the environment, right? And they have knowledge of tactics, techniques, and procedures, and what's common and what to ask, but there's so much complexity in modern tech environments, and so many interactions and interdependencies and ways that credentials are used and APIs are used, that it's really tough to know holistically enough to assure yourself that you've truly evicted a bad actor. And sometimes it's, we touched a little bit on this current telco hack that's going on with up to 8 major U.S. telcos, that they still haven't been able to evict the bad actors. And we've been talking about this for months.
Yeah, and they have no horizon for when that will happen.
Which is, I mean, we don't have enough details, so I don't think we've not really talked about it much, because we don't have any good details to dig into. But that's insane. Like, how is that not getting more press? That is wild. So,
well, the press that it did get was the government telling, even if unofficially, that citizens should start using encrypted applications, because
I heard about that on the new DefSec Today shorts.
I know.
That premiered.
Isn't that cool?
This week. So if you can't get enough of us, Jerry, and I might soon, is putting out these little sub 1 minute shorts on, I think, just YouTube at the moment, right? Is that any place
else? Just YouTube.
So if you can't get enough, find your daily dose of Jerry on YouTube Shorts. Sorry, that just turned into a complete ad. I didn't mean for that to happen.
And there's a little bit of dry humor in them too.
Is that? I thought I was the funny guy. I thought you were the straight guy.
Well, that's why I said dry humor.
Nice.
Not good humor. It's not good humor. It's not Kalat level humor. Let's be honest. So one thing I do want to go back and just to clarify something. I am not dogging on this company or Internet Archive, or like, people are doing
these are hard problems.
They're doing what they can with what they have to work with. I think but something has to change, right? And I think it's hard to expect, roughly speaking, volunteers to know how to execute a really thorough eviction in the aftermath of a compromise like this, because like you just don't know. And somebody who owns a GitHub repository for some open source component doesn't have like the deeper pockets to go hire Mandiant. And so I'm not. This is not intended to be a like bash on the little guy, but at the same time, like we've created this ecosystem that is ungodly complicated and really hard to navigate and very, very difficult to understand where the problems exist and when something bad happens, to know all the little dark corners and rugs to lift up to find where all the bad stuff happened.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing this is reminding of is there's a couple of like assured open source software repositories out there. Like Google's running one. I've never used it. I don't know how good it is, but as an example, they say that for Java and Python images, Google has tested and verified, and like they have some level of like assurance that they're
Mm-hmm.
secure. I have no idea if something like that would have helped in this scenario. How useful that is. I just do see that stuff out there as trying to help give some baseline of known, trusted source of these third-party dependencies. I don't know if it would have applied in this case. I honestly, because this started, as far as I can tell, as like a valid PR check that
Mm-hmm.
was accepted by the maintainers.
Yeah, yeah, and
So
reasonably so, right? I mean, I don't, other than the facts that created the vulnerability in the first place, I don't know that anybody acted really unreasonably or irrationally here. It just was an unfortunate series of events that resulted in a bad thing happen, and then an incomplete eviction process. Because I my guess is the people who were trying to clean it up just never thought that that was a problem, and like I'm not surprised, right? I'm sure they're not incident response people.
right, and they're expensive and not easy to get a hold of, and like not everybody's just got them hanging around when you're doing volunteer open source work.
Right, right. Everything's one of the problems with this, and look, I've been involved in so many incidents over the years. Like that's why I have no
How
hair.
many of those did you cause versus responded to?
Most of them I caused. Let's
Yeah.
just be clear. Um, but it's probably in the into the thousands, and the 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 common the common refrain I see is people just don't understand. They didn't even comprehend that the thing that happened could have happened, because they didn't have that context. It's one of the reasons that I really liked kind of pairing up red team with developers or with what have you, because like it gives a different context. It's like the I still love it, the very popular video of the QA person with the little shape sorter thing saying the round peg goes into the square hole and the rectangular one goes into the square hole, and the point there was that the QA person was like horrified that somebody would not actually pair up the blocks with the associated shape, which is the issue with security. Like we have to defend against things that are attacked in ways that aren't necessarily obvious, and that's always been my experience. It's usually, I mean, there's certainly instances where people have accepted a risk that came to fruition, but those were often the minority cases, right? That didn't happen all that often. It was usually the thing that was just not in people's minds. And I think that
And
as we're progressing down this road, we're creating these really complex systems and we're going to see more of this.
Yeah, complex systems fail in complex ways, which is a
Mm-hmm.
very pithy thing to say, but I think also we may not always be able to understand a failure condition until after it happens, and
Yeah,
then the key is to learn from it and
yeah,
prevent it in the future, which can be the challenge.
yeah. And that was the other thing that always struck me was that in the context of incident response, it was always easy to understand afterwards, right? It wasn't easy to understand before. And so we sit here today, it's easy to say, oh well, geez, like how could they not think to rotate all of the credentials involved, including the ones used for uploading into PyPy? Well, I mean, it's easy for us to sit here and say now. At the time, I doubt that even came into into their conscience. And this may not be a solvable problem, by the way, in the context of like open source environments, because they don't have an incident response team. They don't have a security team. And so I think maybe the real lesson here is for those of us who work for organizations that do have a security team and do produce code and do maintain our own code repositories and whatnot. So I don't mean to be defeatist, right? But I don't see I'm not seeing the way that gets solved in the broader context, unless like GitHub or somebody comes along and radically changes how some of this technology works to be more intrinsically safe. But the reality is, I see things moving in the opposite direction. Like I don't think there's nothing I see is telling me that's where we're going to go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, but in general, I agree. And I wonder if it behooves us, at least in the enterprise software space, to do more vetting of these third-party packages before we pull them into our code to use.
mhm.
So,
All right.
yep.
So that is the
I,
show for today. I don't have a